Elena Vasquez had been playing piano at the Grand Imperial Hotel for nearly 8 years. Every evening she would sit at the beautiful black instrument in the corner of the Hull's famous dining room. Her fingers would dance across the keys, creating soft melodies that floated through the air like gentle whispers. The wealthy guests would eat their expensive meals, drink their fine wines, and sometimes drop a few coins into her glass jar. Most of them never even looked at her face. To them, she was just background noise, something pleasant to hear while they discussed business deals and family matters. She was 43 years old now, with streaks of gray beginning to show in her dark hair. Her hands, once smooth and young, now showed the marks of time and endless hours of practice. But her eyes remained sharp and clear, holding secrets that no one in that elegant room could ever imagine. Elena had not always been a hotel pianist. There was a time, many years ago, when her life was completely different. She had been someone else entirely, living in a small coastal town 3,000 miles away from this cold city dot. The dining room was particularly busy on that November evening. Rich businessmen in expensive suits sat at every table. Their wives wore diamonds that caught the light and sparkled like tiny stars. Waiters in white jackets moved silently between tables, carrying plates of food that cost more than Elena earned in a week. She played a soft jazz piece, her eyes half closed as her fingers moved automatically across the keys. She had played these songs so many times that she barely needed to think about them anymore. Then she saw him walk through the door, and everything changed in an instant. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with silver hair combed neatly back from his forehead. He wore a dark blue suit that probably cost more than Elena's entire apartment. A gold watch glittered on his wrist. 2 younger men followed behind him, clearly his assistants or bodyguards. A hotel manager rushed forward to greet him personally, bowing slightly and leading him to the best table in the room, right next to the large window that overlooked the city lights. Elena's fingers stumbled on the keys for just a moment. Her heart began to beat faster, and she felt a cold sweat forming on her palms. She recognized that face immediately, even though 25 years had passed since she had last seen it. The man was older now, heavier, with deep lines carved into his face. But those eyes were the same. Cold, calculating eyes that had haunted her dreams for more than 2 decades. His name was Richard Sterling, and he was one of the richest men in the country. The newspapers called him a genius businessman, a self-made billionaire who had built his fortune through clever investments and bold decisions. They wrote about his charity work, his donations to hospitals and schools, his beautiful mansion on the hill. What the newspapers did not know, what no one knew except Elena, and perhaps a few others who had long since disappeared, was the truth about how Richard Sterling had really made his first fortune. Elena forced herself to keep playing. Her fingers found their rhythm again, moving through a familiar melody, while her mind raced with memories she had tried so hard to forget. She watched Richard Sterling from the corner of her eye as he sat down and ordered expensive wine. He laughed at something one of his companions said, his teeth white and perfect. He looked like a man without any worries, a man who had never done anything wrong in his entire life. But Elena knew better. She knew the monster that lived behind that polished smile. 25 years ago, Elena had been a different person with a different name. She had been Maria Santos, a young woman of 18 living in the small fishing village of Puerto Esperanza. Her father had been a fisherman, her mother a seamstress. They were poor but happy, living in a small house near the sea. Maria had dreamed of becoming a music teacher. She would play the old piano at the village church every Sunday, and the people would gather to listen and smile. Then Richard Sterling came to Puerto Esperanza, and everything was destroyed. He was not called Richard Sterling back then. He went by a different name, and he came to the village with promises of jobs and money. He said he wanted to build a factory that would bring prosperity to everyone. The village leaders welcomed him with open arms. They did not know that beneath his friendly words lay a heart of pure darkness. They did not know that their small village sat on top of something valuable, something that Richard Sterling wanted for himself at any cost. Elena continued to play, her eyes never leaving the man at the window table. He did not recognize her, Of course, he did not. To him, she had been just another face in a crowd of poor villagers, someone beneath his notice. He probably did not even remember Puerto Esperanza, or he had done there. For him, it was just another step on his path to becoming rich and powerful. But Elena remembered everything. She remembered the night the fire started. She remembered the screams. She remembered her father's face as he pushed her onto the last boat, leaving the harbor. She remembered watching her village burn from the dark water, flames painting the sky orange and red. And she remembered making a promise to herself that one day, somehow, she would find a way to make Richard Sterling pay for what he had done. Now, after 25 years of searching, of changing her name, of learning to survive in a world that had taken everything from her, that day had finally arrived. Richard Sterling sat just 30 feet away from her, completely unaware that his past had finally caught up with him. Elena finished her current song and paused for a moment, pretending to look through her sheet music. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. But no one was paying attention to the simple piano player in the corner. They never did. She had spent years preparing for this moment. She had learned things, discovered secrets, gathered evidence that could destroy Richard Sterling forever. But she could not simply walk up to him and make accusations. He was too powerful, too protected. She needed a different approach, something clever and unexpected, and so Elena began to play a new song, a simple melody that she had composed herself many years ago. It was a tune that most people would find pleasant but forgettable. But to someone who had been in Puerto Esperanza on that terrible night, someone who had heard it playing on the village radio as the fire spread, it would be instantly recognizable. Elena watched Richard Sterling's face as the first notes filled the air. At first, there was no reaction. He continued talking with his companions, sipping his wine. But then, slowly, something changed. His smile faded. His hand holding the wine glass froze in midair. His eyes grew wide, and the color drained from his face. He recognized the song. And in that moment, Richard Sterling turned his head and looked directly at Elena for the first time. Their eyes met across the crowded dining room, and she saw fear in his gaze. Real, genuine fear. The kind of fear she had felt 25 years ago as she watched her home burn. Elena smiled and continued to play, her fingers steady and sure. The game had begun. Richard Sterling could not believe what he was hearing. The melody that filled the dining room was reaching into the deepest corners of his memory, pulling out images and sounds he had buried long ago. His hands began to shake slightly, causing small ripples in his wine glass. The two men sitting with him, his personal assistant James and his head of security Thomas, noticed the change in their boss immediately. James leaned forward with concern on his face. He had worked for Richard Sterling for 15 years and had never seen the man look so disturbed. Richard Sterling was known for his iron control, his ability to remain calm in any situation. Deals worth billions of dollars, threats from competitors, even a kidnapping attempt 3 years ago. Nothing had ever broken his composure like the simple piano tune was doing now. Thomas also noticed something was wrong. His training as a former military officer had taught him to read people quickly. He followed his employer's gaze across the room to the woman playing the piano. She seemed ordinary enough, middle-aged with graying hair, dressed in a simple black dress. But there was something in the way she was looking at Richard Sterling, something knowing and dangerous. Richard Sterling finally tore his eyes away from the piano player and took a long drink of his wine. His throat felt dry, and his heart was beating too fast. He told himself he was being foolish. It was just a song, just a random melody that happened to sound similar to something from his past. The woman playing it was just a hotel musician, nothing more. She could not possibly know anything about Puerto Esperanza. That was a lifetime ago, in a different country, under a different name. All the evidence had been destroyed. All the witnesses had been silenced or scattered. There was no way anyone could connect him to what had happened there. But the song continued, and with each note, more memories flooded back. He remembered the heat of the flames. He remembered the sound of people shouting and crying. He remembered the smell of smoke mixing with the salt air of the sea. And he remembered that exact melody playing from a small radio in the village square The last song Puerto Esperanza ever heard before it ceased to exist. The piano player finished the song and immediately began playing something else, a cheerful popular tune that several guests seemed to recognize. She was not looking at Richard Sterling anymore. She was smiling pleasantly, nodding at guests who passed by her tip jar. It was as if those few minutes of eye contact had never happened. Richard Sterling excused himself from the table, claiming he needed to make an important phone call. He walked quickly to the hotel lobby, his security guard Thomas following close behind. Once they were away from the crowded dining room, Richard Sterling pulled Thomas aside and spoke in a low, urgent voice. He wanted to know everything about the piano player. Her name, her history, where she lived, how long she had worked at the hotel. He wanted this information by tomorrow morning, no later. Thomas nodded without asking questions. He had learned long ago that his job was to follow orders, not to ask why. Richard Sterling then called his private investigator, a man named Marcus, who had helped him bury secrets for over 20 years. Marcus answered on the second ring, and Richard Sterling described the piano player in as much detail as he could remember. He told Marcus about the song, about the way she had looked at him. He said he needed to know if this woman was a threat or just a coincidence. Marcus listened carefully and promised to begin investigating immediately. He had access to databases and resources that most people could not even imagine. If this woman had any connection to Richard Sterling's past, Marcus would find it. After ending the call, Richard Sterling stood alone in a quiet corner of the hotel lobby. His hands were still shaking. He looked down at them with disgust. He had built an empire with these hands. He had shaken hands with presidents and kings. He had signed contracts worth more money than most people would ever see in 1,000 lifetimes. He was not going to let some piano player in a hotel dining room frighten him. He straightened his tie and walked back into the dining room. The woman was still playing, her back straight, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys. Richard Sterling returned to his table and forced himself to smile, to laugh, to act as if nothing had happened. But he could not stop himself from glancing at her every few minutes. And every time he did, he found her looking right back at him with those knowing eyes. Elena knew she had gotten under his skin. She could see it in the stiffness of his shoulders, in the way he kept touching his face, in the nervous movement of his feet under the table. 25 years of waiting, of planning, of holding on to her anger like a precious treasure. And finally, she was seeing the first cracks appear in Richard Sterling's perfect armor. She continued to play normal songs for the rest of the evening. Nothing that would draw attention or raise suspicion. She wanted Richard Sterling to wonder, to worry, to lie awake tonight, trying to figure out who she was and what she wanted. Fear was a powerful weapon, and Elena intended to use it slowly and carefully. The evening passed, and guests came and went. Richard Sterling eventually left around 11 o'clock, surrounded by his assistants and security. He did not look at Elena as he walked out, but she noticed that his steps were slightly faster than when he had arrived. He was trying to appear calm, but he was running away. Elena finished her shift at midnight, as usual. She packed up her sheet music and collected her tips, which were not much but enough to buy groceries for the week. The hotel manager thanked her for another lovely evening, completely unaware of the drama that had played out right under his nose. Outside, the November wind was cold and sharp. Elena wrapped her coat tightly around herself and began the long walk to the bus stop. Her apartment was on the other side of the city, in a neighborhood that no one like Richard Sterling would ever visit. It was small and plain, but it was safe, and it held everything Elena needed for the next stage of her plan. As she walked, Elena thought about her father. He had been a simple man, a fisherman who loved the sea and his family more than anything else in the world. He had taught Elena to play piano on the old instrument at the church. He had told her that music was a gift from God, something beautiful and pure that could never be taken away. He was wrong about that. Richard Sterling had taken everything from them, including the music. For years after Puerto Esperanza, Elena could not even look at a piano without crying. The instrument that had once brought her so much joy had become a reminder of everything she had lost. But slowly, painfully, she had reclaimed it. She had forced herself to practice, to play, to remember why she had loved music in the first place. And she had discovered that the piano could be more than just an instrument of beauty. It could also be a weapon. The bus ride home took 45 minutes. Elena sat by the window and watched the city lights pass by. She thought about what would happen next, about the moves and countermoves that lay ahead. Richard Sterling would investigate her, of course. He would try to find out who she was. But Elena had been careful. The identity of Elena Vasquez was solid, built over many years with patience and attention to detail. Maria Santos had died in the fire that destroyed Puerto Esperanza, at least according to all official records. There was nothing to connect the hotel piano player to the young woman who had escaped on the last boat dock. When Elena finally reached her apartment, she did not turn on the lights. Instead, she walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the city below. Somewhere out there, Richard Sterling was probably doing the same thing, staring into the darkness and wondering what that song had meant. Elena smiled to herself. Tomorrow night, she would play another song from Puerto Esperanza. And the night after that, another one. She would keep playing pieces from the past, each one carrying a different message, a different memory. She would remind Richard Sterling of every terrible thing he had done, one melody at a time. And when he was finally broken, when the weight of his sins had crushed his spirit, then she would reveal herself. She would tell him exactly who she was and exactly what she was going to do. She would show him the evidence she had gathered, the proof of his crimes that she had spent 20 years collecting. And she would watch as his perfect life crumbled into dust. It would not bring back her father, or her mother, or the hundreds of other people who had died in Puerto Esperanza. It would not restore the village that had been erased from the earth as if it had never existed. But it would be justice, the only kind of justice that was possible after so many years. Elena undressed and climbed into bed, but she did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the city and thinking about the past. The memories were painful, but she no longer tried to push them away. She let them wash over her, using them as fuel for the fire that burned in her heart. Richard Sterling had thought he could escape his crimes by changing his name and moving to a new country. He had thought that money and power could protect him from the consequences of his actions. But he was about to learn that some debts can never be escaped. No matter how far you run or how much you pay, the song of Puerto Esperanza was still playing, and it would not stop until justice was finally served. The next 2 weeks became a silent war between Elena and Richard Sterling. Every night, she played at the hotel. Every night, he appeared at some point, sitting at different tables, watching her with those cold, calculating eyes. And every night, Elena wove songs from Puerto Esperanza into her performance. Each one a different piece of the story. She played the melody that had been popular at the village's annual fishing festival, the celebration that marked the beginning of the harvest season. She played the lullaby that mothers used to sing to their children on warm summer nights. She played the hymn that echoed through the old church every Sunday morning, filling the building with hope and faith. Each song was a knife, slowly cutting into Richard Sterling's carefully constructed peace of mind. She could see him growing more agitated with each passing day. He was losing weight. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. His famous composure was cracking, piece by piece. His investigators continued their work, digging deeper into Elena Vasquez's background. They found more gaps, more inconsistencies, but nothing solid enough to explain who she really was. Richard Sterling grew frustrated with their lack of progress. He demanded results, threatened to fire people, threw expensive objects against the walls of his study in fits of rage. His wife, Margaret, noticed the changes in her husband, but said nothing. Their marriage had been cold for years, held together by money and convenience rather than love. She assumed he was having problems with business, or perhaps an affair that had gone wrong. She did not care enough to ask. Meanwhile, Elena was carefully building the next phase of her plan. She had established contact with a journalist named Sarah Chun, a young woman who worked for a major newspaper and had a reputation for fearless reporting. Sarah had been investigating corporate crimes for years and was always looking for new stories. Elena had sent Sarah a sample of her evidence. just enough to prove she was serious. Photographs of young Richard Sterling meeting with known criminals. Documents showing illegal payments. A recording of a conversation where Richard discussed plans to eliminate people who knew too much about his past. Sarah was immediately interested. She wanted to know more, wanted to see all the evidence Elena had gathered. But Elena told her to be patient. The full story would be revealed when the time was right. For now, Sarah needed to wait and watch. Richard Sterling made another attempt to get close to Elena during the third week. He sent his assistant James back to the hotel with a new offer. This time, it was not just an invitation to play at a party. It was an offer of a full-time position as Richard Sterling's personal musician, with a salary that was 20 times what Elena currently earned. Elena turned it down without hesitation. She told James she valued her independence and was happy with her current job. James looked confused by her refusal, but delivered the message to his employer. Richard Sterling was not used to being rejected. His entire life, he had been able to buy whatever and whoever he wanted. The fact that this simple piano player kept refusing his offers made him even more suspicious. She clearly wanted something from him, but what? He decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to bring Elena closer, he would put pressure on her from a distance. He used his influence with the hotel management to suggest that perhaps the evening music program was not necessary anymore. Perhaps the hotel could save money by eliminating the piano player position. The hotel manager was reluctant. Elena was popular with guests, and her music added elegance to the dining room atmosphere. But Richard Sterling was a very important customer who spent thousands of dollars at the hotel every month. His wishes could not be ignored. Elena received the news on a Thursday afternoon. The hotel manager called her into his office and explained, with obvious discomfort, that her position was being eliminated for budget reasons. Her last night would be Saturday. Elena nodded calmly and thanked the manager for the opportunity to work at the hotel. She did not argue or complain. Inside, however, she felt a surge of satisfaction. Richard Sterling had made his move, and it was exactly what she had expected. He was trying to remove her from his sight, hoping that would make the uncomfortable music stop. But he did not understand that Elena did not need the hotel job anymore. She had accomplished what she needed to accomplish there. Richard Sterling knew that someone from his past was watching him, someone who knew the truth about Puerto Esperanza. That knowledge would eat at him day and night, regardless of whether Elena was playing piano or not. On her final Saturday at the hotel, Elena prepared something special. She arrived earlier than usual and spent extra time arranging her music. The dining room was crowded that evening, full of wealthy guests celebrating various occasions. And of course, Richard Sterling was there, sitting at his usual spot near the window. Elena played beautifully for 3 hours, giving perhaps the best performance of her career. She put her heart and soul into every note, creating music so moving that several guests had tears in their eyes. Even the busy waiters paused to listen when she played particularly emotional pieces. Then, at exactly 10 o'clock, Elena stopped playing. She stood up from the piano and looked directly at Richard Sterling. The entire dining room fell silent, sensing that something unusual was happening. Elena walked slowly toward Richard Sterling's table. Every step was deliberate, every movement controlled. She could see the fear growing in his eyes as she approached. He did not know what she was going to do, and that uncertainty was driving him mad. She stopped right in front of his table and spoke loud enough for nearby guests to hear. She said she understood that he had arranged for her to lose her job. She said she was not angry about that. In fact, she was grateful. Playing music for him every night had become tiresome. Then she leaned closer and spoke quietly, so only he could hear. She told him that she knew everything. She knew about Puerto Esperanza, about the fire, about the 342 people who died so he could steal their land. She knew about the deals he made with corrupt officials, the bribes he paid, the witnesses he silenced. Richard Sterling's face went completely white. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Elena continued. She told him that she was one of the survivors, one of the children who escaped on the boats while their homes burned. She had spent 25 years gathering evidence, building a case that would destroy him completely. And now that case was ready. She straightened up and smiled at him, the same pleasant smile she had used every night while playing piano. She told him to enjoy the rest of his evening. Then she turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving Richard Sterling sitting frozen in his chair like a man who had just seen his own ghost. The dining room slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed. Waiters continued serving. Other guests barely noticed what had happened. But for Richard Sterling, everything had changed. The woman he had been trying to identify, the mystery that had been haunting his dreams, finally had a face and a name: Maria Santos. The fisherman's daughter, who was supposed to have died in the fire. She was alive, and she was coming for him. Richard Sterling left the hotel immediately, his security team struggling to keep up with his rapid pace. In the car on the way home, he made phone calls. To his lawyers, to his investigators, to people who specialized in making problems disappear. He was going to need all of them, but even as he mobilized his resources, a cold feeling settled in his stomach. He had escaped justice for 25 years by being careful, by covering his tracks, by eliminating anyone who posed a threat. But this woman, this Elena or Maria or whatever she called herself, had been planning her revenge for just as long. She knew things about him that no one else knew. She had evidence he thought had been destroyed forever. For the first time in decades, Richard Sterling felt truly afraid. Richard Sterling barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flames. He heard screaming. He smelled burning wood and flesh. He woke up several times, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The bedroom of his mansion, with its silk sheets and expensive furniture, felt like a prison cell. By morning, he looked 10 years older. His wife Margaret noticed immediately when he came down for breakfast. She asked if he was feeling well, her voice carrying the distant politeness that had replaced genuine affection in their marriage years ago. Richard told her he was fine, just stress from work. She nodded and returned to her phone, scrolling through social media pictures of her wealthy friends. Thomas, the security chief, arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. He had spent the entire night gathering information, using contacts in the police department and hotel management. He spread several papers across Richard Sterling's desk in the private study, a room where no one else was allowed to enter. The piano player's name was Elena Vasquez. She was 43 years old, born in a small city in the southern part of the country. She had studied music at a local community college and had worked at various hotels and restaurants for the past 20 years. She had no criminal record, no known connections to anyone dangerous, and no obvious reason to be interested in Richard Sterling. On paper, she was completely ordinary, but Thomas had also noticed some strange gaps in her history. There were no records of Elena Vasquez before she was 20 years old. No childhood school records, no family information, nothing. It was as if she had simply appeared out of nowhere when she was already an adult. Thomas said this was unusual, but not impossible. Perhaps she had changed her name at some point, or perhaps the records had been lost or destroyed. Richard Sterling stared at the photograph of Elena that Thomas had obtained from the hotel. She looked back at him with those same knowing eyes, even in the still image. He knew in his gut that this woman was not who she claimed to be. The way she had played that song, the way she had looked at him, it all pointed to something deeper and more dangerous than a simple coincidence. Marcus, the private investigator, called later that morning with his own findings. He had dug deeper than Thomas, using methods that were not entirely legal, but were extremely effective. Marcus confirmed that Elena Vasquez's identity was solid, but relatively new. Before she became Elena Vasquez, she did not seem to exist at all. Marcus suggested several possibilities. She might be a journalist working on an investigation. She might be someone from a business rival trying to dig up dirt. She might be a relative of someone Richard Sterling had wronged in his long career. There were many possibilities, because Richard Sterling had made many enemies over the years. But Marcus also said something that made Richard Sterling's blood run cold. He mentioned that he had found old newspaper archives from a small coastal town in South America, a town called Puerto Esperanza that had been destroyed by a fire 25 years ago. The fire had been ruled an accident, caused by faulty electrical equipment in a factory. Over 300 people had died. The town had never been rebuilt, and the survivors had scattered to the wind. Richard Sterling hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. He had not heard the name Puerto Esperanza spoken aloud in over 2 decades. He had worked very hard to make sure the name was forgotten, that the story of what really happened that was buried forever. And now, suddenly, it was being dug up again. He knew he needed to find out more about Elena Vasquez. He needed to know for certain who she really was and what she wanted. But he also knew he needed to be careful. If she truly was connected to Puerto Esperanza, then she might have information that could destroy him. Moving against her directly could backfire in ways he could not predict. Richard Sterling was not a man who left things to chance. He had built his fortune by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone around him. He decided to return to the Grand Imperial Hotel that evening. He would watch the piano player more carefully. He would try to talk to her, to feel out her intentions. And if necessary, he would take steps to protect himself, whatever that required. Meanwhile, Elena was preparing for her next performance. She had spent the day going over her plan, making sure every detail was perfect. She had chosen the songs she would play that evening with great care. Each one carried a specific memory from Puerto Esperanza, a piece of the story that Richard Sterling would recognize and fear. She also took time to check the safety of her evidence. Hidden in a storage unit across the city, protected by locks and alarms, was a collection of documents and recordings that she had gathered over 20 years. There were photographs of Richard Sterling meeting with corrupt officials. There were financial records showing payments to mercenaries and criminals. There were sworn statements from survivors of Puerto Esperanza, people who had witnessed what really happened and were willing to testify. This evidence was Elena's insurance policy. If anything happened to her, copies of everything would be sent to journalists, prosecutors, and human rights organizations around the world. Richard Sterling might be powerful, but he was not powerful enough to suppress the truth once it was out in the open. Elena arrived at the hotel at 6 o'clock. As usual, she set up her sheet music and tested the piano keys, making sure everything was in tune. The dining room was quiet at this early hour, only a few guests drinking cocktails at the bar. The evening rush would begin soon. She was playing a gentle warm-up piece when she felt someone approach. Looking up, she saw a young man in an expensive suit. He introduced himself as Jane's personal assistant to Richard Sterling. He said his employer had enjoyed her music last night and wanted to invite her to play at a private party next week. The pay would be very generous. Elena kept her face perfectly calm, even though her heart was racing. This was unexpected. Richard Sterling was reaching out to her directly, trying to get closer. He was either planning something dangerous or simply trying to gather more information. Either way, it was a risk. She told James that she was flattered by the offer, but would need to check her schedule. She asked him to leave a card with the hotel manager, and she would be in touch. James nodded politely and walked away, but Elena noticed him pull out his phone and send a text message as soon as he thought she was not looking. The evening shift began, and the dining room filled with guests. Elena played her usual mix of jazz and classical pieces, watching the entrance from the corner of her eye. She was not surprised when Richard Sterling walked in around 8 o'clock, earlier than the previous night. He was alone this time, no assistants or bodyguards visible. He took a table near the center of the room, not as close to Elena as before, but still within clear view. A waiter brought him wine and a menu, but he barely glanced at either. His attention was focused entirely on the piano player. Elena finished her current song and paused for a moment. Then she began to play the second melody from Puerto Esperanza, a sad and haunting tune that had been popular at funerals in the village. It was the song that had played when they buried the children who died in the factory explosion, the first victims of Richard Sterling's greed. She watched his face as the music filled the room. This time, there was no surprise. He had been expecting something like this, but she could still see the effect the song had on him. His jaw tightened. His fingers gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. His eyes never left her face, burning with a mixture of fear and hatred. Elena played the song all the way through, taking her time with every note. When it was finished, she moved on to a cheerful popular tune, as if nothing had happened. But the message had been delivered. She knew it, and Richard Sterling knew it. He stayed in the dining room for 2 more hours, ordering food he did not eat, and wine he barely touched. He was waiting for something, perhaps hoping Elena would come talk to him, perhaps planning his own approach. But Elena gave him nothing. She played her music, smiled at guests, and pretended he was invisible. Finally, around 10:30, Richard Sterling stood up and walked slowly toward the piano. Elena's heart beat faster, but she kept playing, her fingers steady on the keys. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to speak without being overheard. He told her she played beautifully. He said he recognized some of the songs she had chosen, and they reminded him of places he had visited long ago. His voice was calm and controlled, but his eyes were burning with questions. Elena looked up at him and smiled pleasantly. She thanked him for the kind words. She said music had a way of bringing back memories, both happy and sad. She hoped the memories her songs had stirred were not too painful. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Two people who both knew they were playing a dangerous game, each trying to read the other's intentions. Then Richard Sterling nodded slowly and walked away without another word. Elena watched him leave the dining room, her smile fading as soon as his back was turned. The first real confrontation had happened, and she had held her ground. But she knew this was only the beginning. Richard Sterling would not give up so easily. He would keep pushing, keep investigating, until he found out the truth. And when he did, Elena would be ready. The days following Elena's revelation were chaos for Richard Sterling. He barely slept, barely ate, and spent nearly every waking hour in meetings with lawyers and security experts. His normally well-organized mind was scattered, jumping from one worry to another without finding any solutions. His legal team advised him to remain calm. They said that even if this woman had evidence, it would be difficult to prosecute crimes that happened 25 years ago in a foreign country. The statute of limitations might have expired. The evidence might not be admissible in court. There were many legal barriers that could protect him, but Richard Sterling knew that criminal prosecution was not his only worry. Even if he never went to prison, even if no charges were ever filed, the revelation of what happened in Puerto Esperanza would destroy everything he had built. His reputation, his business relationships, his political connections, all of it would crumble if the truth came out. He also worried about Elena herself. She had shown remarkable patience and intelligence in tracking him down and gathering evidence. She was not some impulsive fool who would make mistakes he could exploit. She was a careful planner, just like him. And that made her extremely dangerous. His investigators finally made progress on the 5th day after Elena's confrontation. They had traced her movements and discovered the storage unit where she kept her evidence. They had also found the apartment where she lived and had placed it under surveillance. Richard Sterling considered his options. He could have his people break into the storage unit and destroy the evidence. He could have Elena followed and intimidated, or worse. He had done such things before, long ago, when he was building his empire, and obstacles needed to be removed. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the memory of Puerto Esperanza, the screams and the flames that still haunted his dreams. Perhaps it was the knowledge that Elena had certainly made copies of her evidence and distributed them to trusted people. Perhaps it was simply the exhaustion of carrying his secrets for so long. Or perhaps, somewhere deep inside him, there was a small voice that said he deserved whatever was coming. While Richard Sterling struggled with his demons, Elena was taking the final steps of her plan. She met with Sarah Chun, the journalist, in a quiet coffee shop far from any place Richard Sterling's people might be watching. She gave Sarah everything, all the documents and photographs and recordings she had, spent 20 years collecting. Sarah was stunned by the scope of the evidence. It told a story of corruption, greed, and murder that would shock the world. Richard Sterling, the beloved philanthropist and business genius, was actually a monster who had built his fortune on the bodies of innocent people. Elena also told Sarah her own story. She described her childhood in Puerto Esperanza, her father's fishing boat, her dreams of becoming a music teacher. She described the night the fire started, the confusion and terror as flames consumed everything she knew. She described watching from the water as her home burned, never knowing until years later that the fire had been deliberately set. Sarah listened with tears in her eyes. She promised to tell this story properly, to make sure the world knew the truth. She said it would take time to verify everything and write the article carefully, but she estimated it would be ready to publish within 2 weeks. Elena nodded and thanked her. 25 years of waiting, and now there were only 2 more weeks until justice would finally come. She could be patient a little longer, but Richard Sterling was not willing to wait. His fear had transformed into something else, something desperate and dangerous. He decided he needed to confront Elena directly, to understand what she really wanted. Perhaps there was a way to make this go away. Perhaps she could be bought, or reasoned with, or convinced to abandon her revenge. He tracked her down through his investigators, who reported that she spent most afternoons in a small park near her apartment. She would sit on a bench by the fountain, feeding birds and watching children play. It seemed like a strange activity for someone planning to destroy a billionaire, but Richard Sterling did not care. He just needed to talk to her. He went alone, against the advice of his security team. He wore casual clothes instead of his usual expensive suits, trying to look less intimidating. He found Elena exactly where his investigators said she would be, sitting peacefully on a bench with a bag of breadcrumbs in her lap. He sat down next to her without asking permission. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the park filled the silence, children laughing and birds singing and water splashing in the fountain. Finally, Richard Sterling asked her what she wanted. He asked if this was about money, because he could give her more money than she could ever spend. He asked if it was about recognition, because he could help her become famous and successful. He asked if there was anything at all, that would make her stop. Elena turned to look at him, and he was surprised by the calm in her eyes. There was no hatred there, no burning rage, just a deep, profound sadness that seemed to reach down into the very core of her being. She told him that she had dreamed of this moment for 25 years. She had imagined all the things she would say to him, all the accusations she would make, all the pain she would cause him. But now that she was finally here, sitting next to the man who had destroyed her entire world, she found that the words did not come easily. She asked him if he remembered the fishing boats. The village had been famous for its colorful boats, painted bright blue and yellow and red. They would line up along the shore in the morning, their sails catching the sunrise. She asked if he remembered the children playing on the beach, building sandcastles and chasing crabs. Richard Sterling said nothing. His hands were trembling. Elena continued. She told him about her father, a kind man who had never hurt anyone in his life. She told him about her mother, who made the best fish stew in the village. She told him about her little brother Carlos, who was only 7 years old when the fire killed him. He had wanted to be a boat captain when he grew up. Her voice broke slightly as she spoke about Carlos. It was the first crack in her composure, the first sign of the grief that lay beneath her calm surface. She told Richard Sterling that she could not be bought or reasoned with. There was no amount of money in the world that could bring back her family or restore her village. There was nothing he could offer that would erase the memories of that terrible night. All she wanted was justice. She wanted the world to know what he had done. She wanted the families of the victims to finally understand why their loved ones had died. She wanted Richard Sterling to face the consequences of his actions, even if those consequences came 25 years too late. Richard Sterling sat in silence for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He said he was sorry. He said he had never meant for so many people to die. He said the fire was supposed to be small, just enough to scare the villagers into leaving so he could take their land. He said things had gotten out of control. Elena listened without interrupting. She had waited 25 years to hear these words, and now they meant nothing to her. An apology could not undo murder. Regret could not rebuild a village. Richard Sterling's guilt, however genuine it might be, could not bring Carlos back to life. She stood up from the bench and brushed the breadcrumbs from her lap. She told Richard Sterling that she had already given all her evidence to a journalist. The story would be published soon. probably within a couple of weeks. There was nothing he could do to stop it. She said he should use the time he had left to think about what he wanted to do. He could run, but he would be running for the rest of his life. He could fight, but he would eventually lose. Or he could face what he had done and accept the consequences like a man. Then she walked away, leaving Richard Sterling alone on the bench with his guilt and his memories. The article appeared on Sunday morning as scheduled, and the world exploded. Sarah Chun's investigation was picked up by news outlets in every country. Richard Sterling's name became synonymous with corporate greed and cold-blooded murder. The man who had been celebrated as a genius and a philanthropist was revealed as a monster who had built his empire on the ashes of an innocent village. Within hours, Richard Sterling's business partners began cutting ties with him. His company's stock price collapsed. Politicians who had once posed for photographs with him rushed to delete those images from their websites. The charities he had supported returned his donations. The beautiful house he had built was surrounded by protesters demanding justice. True to his word, Richard Sterling did not run or fight. He appeared on television looking older and more tired than anyone had ever seen him. He confirmed that the article was true and apologized to the victims of Puerto Esperanza and their families. He announced that he was surrendering all his assets to a trust fund that would provide for survivors and support rebuilding efforts. On the land where the village once stood, authorities from multiple countries opened investigations. Richard Sterling cooperated with all of them, providing testimony and evidence that would eventually lead to the arrest of several other people who had helped him cover up the disaster. Many of these people were still in positions of power, and their downfall sent shockwaves through political and business circles around the world. The legal process took years to complete. Richard Sterling was eventually convicted of multiple charges related to the deaths in Puerto Esperanza. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, a fate that many considered too lenient for his crimes. But it was justice nonetheless, the kind of justice that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Elena watched all of this from a distance. She gave interviews to journalists and testified at legal proceedings, but she avoided the spotlight as much as possible. The attention made her uncomfortable. She had not done what she did for fame or recognition. She had done it for her family, for her village, for the memory of everyone who had died that terrible night. 6 months after the article was published, Elena made the journey she had been planning for so long. She flew to South America and took a bus to the coast where Puerto Esperanza had once stood. The village was gone, of course, swallowed by time and nature. But the land remained, the beautiful hills rolling down to the sparkling sea. She walked along the shore, her bare feet leaving prints in the sand. She could almost hear the voices of children playing, the songs of fishermen heading out to sea, the bells of the church calling people to worship. The memories were painful, but also precious, pieces of a life that had been taken from her too soon. She found a spot on a small hill overlooking the water. From here, she could see where her family's house had stood, where the church had been, where the boats had lined up along the shore. She sat down in the grass and let the tears come, finally allowing herself to grieve for everything she had lost. She stayed there for hours, talking to her father and mother and little Carlos as if they could hear her. She told them about her life, about the years of searching and planning, about the final confrontation with Richard Sterling. She told them that justice had been done, that the man who destroyed their home would spend the rest of his days in a prison cell, and she told them that she was going to be okay. For 25 years, revenge had been her reason for living. Now that it was complete, she needed to find a new purpose. She was not sure what that would be, but she was no longer afraid of the future. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Elena made a decision. She would stay here, in this place where her story had begun. She would use her share of the money from Richard Sterling's estate to help rebuild the community, to create opportunities for other families who had lost everything. She would teach piano to local children, passing on the gift her father had given her so many years ago. She would not let Puerto Esperanza be forgotten. She would make sure that the memory of her village lived on, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the strength of ordinary people who, refused to be erased. Elena stood up and brushed the grass from her clothes. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars that had shone over Puerto Esperanza when she was a child. She looked up at them and felt, for the first time in 25 years, something like peace. The journey that began with a simple song played for a rich man had finally reached its end. Elena had carried her burden of grief and anger across decades and continents. She had faced the monster who destroyed her world and watched him fall. She had told her story to the world and seen justice done. Now it was time to put down that burden and start again. Not as Maria Santos, the fisherman's daughter who died in a fire. Not as Elena Vasquez, the hotel pianist who played coded messages of revenge. But as something new, someone who had walked through fire and emerged on the other side. She took one last look at the ocean, silver now in the fading light. Somewhere out there was the spot where her father's boat had carried her to safety all those years ago. Somewhere out there was the place where her old life had ended and her new life had begun. Elena smiled and turned away from the sea. There was work to be done, a community to build, children to teach. The past would always be part of her, but it would no longer control her. The song of Puerto Esperanza would continue, not as a lament for what was lost, but as a celebration of what could still be. And on quiet evenings, when the wind was calm and the stars were bright, the people of the new community would sometimes hear music drifting from a small house on the hill. A woman would be playing piano, her fingers dancing over the keys with grace and passion. The melodies were sometimes sad and sometimes joyful, but they were always beautiful. They were the songs of Puerto Esperanza, played not in anger or grief, but in love. Love for the family Elena had lost. Love for the village that had shaped her. Love for the life she was finally learning to live. And if anyone asked who the piano player was, the locals would smile and say that her name was Elena and that she had a story like no other. But she preferred not to talk about it much. She preferred to let her music speak for itself, carrying messages that only those who listened carefully could understand. Messages of loss and redemption. Messages of justice and mercy. Messages of endings that were also beginnings. The simple songs of a woman who had finally found her way home. The next 12 days were the longest of Richard Sterling's life. He went through the motions of his normal routine, attending meetings and signing documents and giving orders. But his mind was somewhere else entirely, trapped in an endless cycle of fear and regret. His lawyers worked around the clock, preparing defenses for charges that had not yet been filed. His public relations team drafted responses to questions that had not yet been asked. His security team watched Elena's apartment constantly, reporting her movements but never taking any action. Richard Sterling had forbidden them from interfering with her. He was tired of fighting. His wife Margaret noticed that something was seriously wrong. For the first time in years, she actually tried to talk to her husband to understand what was troubling him. But Richard Sterling pushed her away. He could not tell her the truth. He could barely admit it to himself. In his quieter moments, usually late at night when sleep would not come, Richard Sterling found himself thinking about the person he used to be. Before Puerto Esperanza, before the fire, before he learned that some people would do anything for money and power. He had grown up poor, the son of a factory worker who died young and a mother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. He had sworn that he would escape poverty, that he would become rich and powerful and never feel helpless again. And he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But at what cost? He remembered the moment he had decided to destroy Puerto Esperanza. It had seemed so logical at the time, so necessary for his business plans. The village sat on top of valuable mineral deposits, and the villagers refused to sell their land. They were stubborn, attached to their homes and their fishing boats and their simple way of life. They did not understand that progress required sacrifice. So Richard Sterling had made them sacrifice. He had paid corrupt officials to ignore safety regulations in the factory he built near the village. He had paid men to start a fire that would frighten the villagers into leaving. He had never intended for so many people to die. The wind had changed direction unexpectedly, spreading the flames faster than anyone anticipated. By the time the fire was finally controlled, Puerto Esperanza had ceased to exist. Richard Sterling had fled the country, changed his name, and started over. He used the money he made from selling the village's land to build his business empire. He became rich, then richer, than one of the richest men in the world. He married a beautiful woman, donated to charities, shook hands with presidents. He became everything he had dreamed of becoming as a poor boy, watching his mother struggle to pay the bills, but he had never been able to escape the memories. They came to him in dreams, in quiet moments, in the faces of strangers who reminded him of people who had died. He had built walls around his guilt, tried to bury it under money and success. But it had never really gone away, Dot. And now, thanks to the daughter of a fisherman who had refused to forget, the walls were coming down. Sarah Chun's article was almost ready. She had verified every piece of evidence, interviewed other survivors of Puerto Esperanza, and documented Richard Sterling's rise to power with meticulous detail. It was the story of a lifetime, the kind of journalism that won prizes and changed the world. She called Elena 2 days before publication to let her know. The article would appear on the front page of the newspaper's Sunday edition. It would also be published online, with links to all the supporting documents. By Monday morning, everyone in the country would know the truth about Richard Sterling. Elena thanked Sarah for her dedication and professionalism. She said she was glad that the victims of Puerto Esperanza would finally have their story told. She said she hoped it would bring some measure of peace to the families who had lost loved ones. But when she hung up the phone, Elena did not feel the triumph she had expected. Instead, she felt empty. She had spent 25 years building toward this moment, and now that it was almost here, she was not sure what to feel. Revenge, she realized, was a strange thing. It gave you purpose when you had lost everything else. It kept you going through the darkest moments. But it could also consume you, leaving nothing behind when it was finally achieved. Elena thought about what she would do after the article was published. She had no family left, no real friends, no career except the piano playing she had used as a cover for her true mission. Her entire adult life had been dedicated to destroying Richard Sterling. Without that purpose, who would she be? She decided to return to Puerto Esperanza. The village itself was long gone, but the land remained, the beautiful coastline where she had played as a child. She would go there and say goodbye to her family properly, something she had never had the chance to do. Then she would figure out what came next. The night before the article was published, Elena had a visitor. She heard a knock on her apartment door around midnight, soft but insistent. She looked through the peephole and saw Richard Sterling standing alone in the hallway. Her first instinct was fear. Had he come to hurt her, to eliminate the threat she posed before it was too late? But something in his posture told her otherwise. He looked broken, defeated, like a man who had finally stopped running. She opened the door, but kept the chain on. She asked what he wanted. Richard Sterling spoke slowly, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. He said he had come to thank her. He said that for 25 years he had lived with the weight of what he had done, pretending everything was fine while his soul rotted away inside him. He said Elena had forced him to face the truth, and in a strange way, it was a relief. He also said he was sorry. Not the polished apology of a public relations statement, but a raw, genuine expression of remorse that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. He said he knew it was not enough, could never be enough, but he needed to say it anyway. Elena listened without speaking. She had imagined this moment many times over the years, but it was different from what she had expected. She had thought she would feel satisfaction seeing her enemy brought low. Instead, she felt a strange kind of pity. Richard Sterling continued. He said he was not going to run or fight. When the article was published, he would face whatever came. He had already contacted his lawyers and told them to cooperate fully with any investigation. He had also arranged to donate the majority of his fortune to charitable organizations, including a fund for survivors of Puerto Esperanza and their descendants. It was not justice, he said. Nothing could ever be justice for what he had done. But it was what he could offer. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was an old photograph, faded and worn from years of handling. He held it up so Elena could see. The photograph showed a young woman playing piano in what looked like a church, surrounded by smiling villagers. Richard Sterling said he had kept this photograph for 25 years. He did not know why. Perhaps it was a reminder of the life he had destroyed. Perhaps it was a form of self-punishment. But he thought Elena should have it now. It belonged to her. Elena took the photograph with trembling hands. She recognized the image immediately. It was her, Maria Santos, playing the piano at the village church on a Sunday morning. Her father was standing in the crowd, his face beaming with pride. Tears began to fall down Elena's cheeks. She had thought she had no photographs left from Puerto Esperanza. Everything had been destroyed in the fire. But here was proof that her old life had existed, that she had once been a happy girl with a family who loved her. She looked up at Richard Sterling, and for the first time, she saw him not as a monster, but as a broken human being. He had done terrible things, unforgivable things. But he was also capable of this small act of kindness, this gesture of humanity that she had not expected. She told him that she could not forgive him. Some wounds were too deep to heal, some debts too great to pay. But she thanked him for the photograph. It meant more to her than he could know. Richard Sterling nodded and turned to leave. At the elevator, he paused and looked back. He said he hoped she would find peace, whatever that meant for her. Then he stepped into the elevator and was gone. Elena closed her door and sat down with the photograph in her hands. She stayed like that for hours, looking at her father's face and crying for everything she had lost.